Good evening to everyone. On behalf of the Division of Education at the American College of Surgeons, I would like to warmly welcome you to this webinar on advice and guidance to international and osteopathic medical students applying to surgical residency. International and osteopathic medical students are faced with unique challenges when applying to surgical residencies. Tonight's panel will address these challenges and provide you with the tools and resources you need to succeed. I would like to take a moment to thank the panelists, committee members working in the chat this evening, and our ACS staff, especially our Committee on Medical Student Administrator, Cassie Buscignani, which spearheaded planning and organizing this webinar. I would like to give a special thank you to PJ Schnartz, who is the chair of our Committee on Medical Student Education at the college. He is a tremendous leader and is very welcoming to our staff. Before I hand it over, though, this is a kind reminder to please complete the survey at the end of our webinar. So without further ado, I will hand over the baton over to PJ to get the webinar started. Thank you so much again for attending and hope you enjoy this evening.
Thank you, Michelle. Welcome to everybody who is joining us both near and far. We have a great panel tonight. I'm going to let each of the panelists introduce themselves and what they do. Per my routine in working with people, I like to use first names because we are all equal in this journey towards getting you guys into residency and answering your questions. And so we will get started with the panel right now. You guys have each, or many of you have submitted questions. We've coalesced them together. I'll use that as the sort of jump off point for most of the questions, and we will get started. Why don't I start by having our two residents. We'll start with Fumiko. Introduce yourselves, and then we'll just go around and say hello and tell us where you're from and where you're at and what do you want to do.
I'm Fumiko. I'm one of the chief residents at Creighton University. I'm originally from California and had a very non-traditional path to getting into medical school as well as residency. I'm a proud graduate of St. George's University, so I am one of the IMGs, and I am in the process of applying for a colorectal fellowship.
Hi, my name's Krista. I just finished my third year of general surgery residency at the University of Nebraska. I'm starting a 2-year research fellowship at UT Houston in pediatric surgery. I graduated from Rocky Vista College of Osteopathic Medicine in 2020 in Colorado.
Jen, why don't you introduce yourself?
Jen Beatty, thanks for having me. I'm a colon and rectal surgeon, and I'm an MD by training from the University of Iowa. Did my fellowship at Creighton. I was a program director for over 10 years, so I know what it's like to screen applicants who are MD, DO, and international medical grads. And for the last couple of years, I've been associate dean at an osteopathic school in Des Moines, Iowa, where my primary role is to help our medical students match into competitive and non-competitive fields. So I've learned a lot about that landscape too. Thank you.
That leads us to you, Jim.
Okay, well, so I'm Jim Residency. My day job is working for the New York Presbyterian Healthcare Enterprise, which is an organization of about 30 healthcare facilities in and around New York City mostly, but sometimes far-flung. For instance, New York Presbyterian Houston Methodist is one of our hospitals. In New York City, there are 4 principal teaching hospitals, the 2 university hospitals of Columbia and Cornell, and 2 community-based hospitals, the New York Hospital of Queens and New York Presbyterian Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, where I am the program director of the surgical residency and the director of education. The reason that I may be of special interest to this panel is that I have a part-time job, which is I'm the chair of surgery for the St. George's University School of Medicine.
Well, welcome everybody. My name is PJ Schnartz. I am a past program director for about 12 years. I, like Jen Beatty, work at I'm an MD by training, and I work both at Creighton University School of Medicine and the Des Moines University College of Osteopathic Medicine. So I think we've got a great panel. Let me throw out the first question to either one of the residents or both who want to answer it. One of the questions that we got in advance was, how can we be more competitive at programs that are not traditionally friendly to either international graduates or osteopathic graduates? What advice would you give our participants?
I would say the first thing I have to say is making sure that your application is well-rounded. And I think, I ended up at a pretty academic institution, a university-based institution from an osteopathic school, which provided me with a lot of academic resources and research resources in particular that I hadn't had prior. But I was still able to do that based on the things that I could complete in my application. And I think the other key point to that is making sure that the things that you do participate in are things that you're passionate about and things that you can talk about on your interviews. And that goes a long way in terms of having meaningful experiences with the resources that you do have available to you.
To second Krista, being very well-rounded, I had a non-traditional background. I did clinical research for 4 years prior and continued to do research throughout medical school, which I think strengthened my application. But separately, I was involved in different volunteer groups as well as different leadership positions throughout the medical school experience, and was able to talk about these because they were activities I'd done all 4 years and that I was very passionate about. And so I think that gave more talking points to the CV, because if you get an interview, you're already qualified. We already know you have the scores. We already know that you can write a beautiful essay. But the point of the interview is to get to know you and really showing that you are a well-rounded candidate, not on paper, but also, I guess, via Zoom these days.
So sometimes being well-rounded means completing research and things like that. Jim and Jen, what is your advice for applicants with respect to research? Is that a requirement to get into surgery, in your opinions, or what are your guys' thoughts?
I'll tell you my thoughts. Because I saw that was a question that came through in the previously submitted questions in a number of different places. I think it has to be very individual to the program director, but to me, participation in research has to do with my perception of how well the candidate has achieved being able to pick up a project, carry it to completion, and organize it in a way so there's a finished thing. So to me, looking at a publication, even in a not very high penetrance journal, is a more important thing than having done groundbreaking translational research that has not resulted in publication.
Jim, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, Jim, I agree with that. But at the same time, we don't want students doing research at the expense of their classes or their board scores, because if they've got some yellow and red flags on their application, no amount of research is going to overcome those little flags that we see. So again, taking a careful look at who you are as an applicant. If it's something you can add, great. All residents are going to be required to participate in a quality improvement project at a minimum and scholarly activity. And how wonderful is it to have somebody come in who knows how to do those things and hit the ground running?
I agree with you 100%. And it's an interesting thing that the St. George's actually takes an institutional approach to this. So those students who wish to be more closely involved in research can participate in the Medical Students Research Institute, the MSRI. And participation in the MSRI requires that you have a successful academic record to that point and are not adding on to an already overburdened schedule.
So let me ask Krista and Fumiko. We have some preclinical students on with us. What would you recommend for them to do in their first 2 years to stand out?
That's a tough question. I think that again, in your first years of medical school, as you're just starting to sort of work in this new environment. I think making sure that you're doing well in your studies and performing well at school is probably the most important thing. I think, the first 2 years, it's easy to get involved in things around your school, whether it be, association clubs or tutoring or anatomy lab opportunities. I think those are all really great. And as well as like local volunteer opportunities. It's also never too early to start making connections. So if you have professors or upper level students, or maybe you have residents who come and talk at your meetings, starting to build relationships with those people, I think ultimately are important goals for your first 2 years or preclinical years of medical school.
Yeah, I think I agree with Krista. Really, you have to do well. You need to know the knowledge. These preclinical factoids, if you will, they do come back in your exams. They do come back on daily rounds. You really commit yourself to learning about and doing well in your courses. I know the structure of how the steps and scoring has changed since I applied for residency. But also, I was very dedicated to carving time out to do volunteer work, on a monthly basis with one of our student interest groups. I thought that was very fulfilling for me, and it was a way for me to give back to the community. It was something that I could talk about at length, but it also it grounded me in my studies, and it gave me something to look forward to. So it's not all just time in the study hall or in your office at the computer, watching lectures, doing new world questions. I think making sure you have something else, another outlet as well to maintain your mental health, or a study group or a friend group that you can meet with on a regular basis to blow off some steam.
So let me ask Jen a question. I'm going to ask Jim a corollary question. With COMLEX, Jen, going past fail and USMLE going past fail, what's your advice for our osteopathic colleagues on should you take both USMLE and COMLEX or one or the other? What are your thoughts?
Everybody on this webinar is interested in surgery or something surgical. So my answer to you all is yes, you do need to take USMLE step 2 and 1 to be considered competitive. Why is that? There has been shown a pretty significant difference in scores on COMLEX compared to USMLE, and you need to show that you can compete on the same stage. For those who are nervous, because pass-fail boards for step 1, focus on your shelf exams or your COMAT. So those directly predict your COMLEX 2 and therefore your USMLE step 2. So you already have known predictors.
So Jim, I'm going to put you on the spot here, my friend, and I'm sorry. But now that USMLE is pass-fail for step 1 and then has a score for step 2, how do you think that's going to influence program directors like yourself in selecting residents?
Right. Well, one of the questions that came through is step 2 going to be the new step 1? And if you look at the NRMP's survey of program directors, you'll see that the highest factor for consideration of program directors, of all the program directors interviewed, was performance on standardized examinations in USMLE step 1 when it was available, and then secondarily the USMLE step 2 with the and it relates to a critical aspect of how residencies are accredited. So there are a number of factors that the accreditation body, the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, and its arm, the Residency Review Committees, require, which is success on the both the written and oral board of the American examination of the American Board of Surgery. And so there's a fixed rate that programs are expected to achieve. It's 68%. And although that sounds like it may be low, keep in mind that passing for the Residency Review Committee means passing both the written and the oral on your first try, or else it's a fail. So program directors are very concerned with seeing how the applicant's performance has been on previous standardized examinations. We know there's a good correlation between performance on the shelf exam and the USMLE, shelf exams and the USMLE exam subsequently. And I think many or most, or maybe even all program directors think that there's a good correlation between performance on previous standardized examinations and success on the American Board of Surgery examination.
So let me ask again our two residents, and I'm going to say something at the risk of hopefully not offending anybody, but and the college does not believe in this at all, or we would not be having this webinar. But I think unfortunately there is some there is some discrimination and bias that occurs both with international grads and with osteopathic grads. Again, the college doesn't believe in that, and nor does anybody on this panel or anybody answering these questions. But how, from a resident standpoint, how would you recommend being prepared for interviews and dealing with that? I know it's a loaded question, but I think it's like the elephant in the room. What are you guys' thoughts on how to deal proactively with that potential for bias?
So I sort of feel like there's a couple different places where I've experienced this. And I'll, start with the positive is since I've been a resident, I have had very little like interactions or commenting on the fact that I have an osteopathic degree as opposed to my counterparts. And I'm one of 2 DOs in my entire program now. So I think that speaks a lot to my institution as well as like the changing of the institutions. And I think that, in terms of once I entered residency, I heard a lot less about that than when I was in medical school. But I think as, in osteopathic training, it's a common theme. And when you're applying to surgical residencies, it's often visited. I completed, as I'm sure a lot of our osteopathic medical students are, quite a number of sub-Is, and I wasn't quite sure where I wanted to go. And I wasn't sure if I was interested in academics. So I did some sub-Is at some more, what we'd consider to be academic institutions. And I think that I applied to some programs where there were no osteopathic physicians, and they were, pretty open about the fact that they haven't had any. And I think, the best thing you can do in that situation is keeping an open mind. And when they make comments about it, you just, continue to be you and to perform the way that you would any other way. And I think, through that, I've had some positive comments about, I haven't interacted with osteopathic medical students before, and this has sort of changed my perspective. So I think, in terms of, advocating for the osteopathic profession as well, that's a unique opportunity, and you can always sort of keep that in the back of your mind.
How about you, Famika? I know, you're from California, so it's, people I think who hail from other countries, may be viewed differently than a U.S. citizen, international grad versus somebody else. What are your thoughts?
Sure. Similar to Krista, I did a ton of sub-Is. I felt like most of my 4th year was sub-Is and then the mandatory requirements to graduate. And some of my sub-Is were at programs or institutions that I was interested in applying to because I know they had taken either DOs or IMGs in the past and seemed more friendly. And then there were other programs where they had never had an IMG, but similar to Krista, during the interview process, they said, well, some of the faculty had said, you're very impressive on paper, you're very impressive in person when we had in-person interviews, but that they'd also started working with faculty who were either IMGs or FMGs or DOs, and that, we're no less professional, no less capable clinically and otherwise. And they were very, very impressed, and it had changed their minds and inspired them to shift the culture. Obviously, it doesn't come around immediately. While I was at St. George's, the common theme, I would say, in our preclinical years was whatever the national average is for step 1 and step 2, you have to score at least 10 points higher in order to be considered or to be taken seriously, or to be considered even close to equal with your American medical school counterparts. I don't know if that's necessarily true. Having gone through the Creighton application and residency interview process on the other side this past year, I don't know that that's necessarily true, at least at our program, and I'm very grateful that our program does not discriminate.
So Jen, I know one of the things you do, because you've shared it with me, and I know Jim believes in this too, is that there's a lot of resources out there for people to use and see, you know, am I competitive for surgery? What's important from a program director's perspective? Can you just describe a little bit what advice you give our osteopathic students here? And I'm imagining Jim does the same at St. George's.
Yeah, we start off by recognizing that there is a bias. It does exist, and it's getting better, but it's slow. Remember, the merger happened between the osteopaths and the allopaths in 2019 into the 2020 match. And so from that time, we saw an increase of only about 8% matching into general surgery who were osteopathic. Now it's almost 15%. So that's a huge movement of the needle in a short amount of time. So just recognizing the bias exists. They do need to be bigger, better, stronger, faster. When they go out on a sub internship and they are auditioning, they're on a 30-day long interview. They have to hit this so hard and impress all the time. I show all the data that we have available. It's from the NRMP. There's the program director surveys. They've been running them annually. They're usually every other year, but they've been really coming out rapid fire because of so many changes in the application process. And I make sure they understand the charting data outcomes from the NRMP, which shows what percent of DOs match. You can also look the same thing up for IMGs and for specifically MDs, based on research experience and board scores and all sorts of things. So there is hard data out there, and I make sure our students are aware of what's been done in the past so they can extrapolate going forward.
So Jim, let me ask you a similar question as the chair of surgery at St. George's, but as also a program director. What are your thoughts on things like observerships and shadowing? Does that move the needle for you, or are you looking for a more formal experience?
I think I'm looking for a more formal experience. I think both institutionally, the school, and in my own program, I'm looking for people to come in and do a fourth-year elective of some kind. I used to be very negative about this. You know, in history, I would say, well, you know, you should be choosing your fourth-year electives based on what your unfilled educational needs are. But over the course of time, I've come to realize that this introduction of an applicant to a program can be very helpful to the applicant. It provides a place where in that specific location, they can prove themselves and become familiar with the people there. And in fact, there's an SGU graduate in my own program who did that. He became known to us and became a reasonable applicant, or a very competitive applicant, after having done his fourth-year elective with us. It also can be a way to get high-quality letters of recommendation, which is, when you look at the NRMP data, is still an important thing to program directors. You know, what the Office of Career Guidance at SGU says is, well, yeah, when you go to a fourth-year elective, you know, go to the program director and say, you know, I'd like your support with a letter of recommendation if I do well on this rotation, and then to go forth and do well on the rotation, and then to go to them at the end and say, you know, I did a good job. Will you please write me a letter? And it's a way of accomplishing that goal also, particularly in if you think about it, that SGU students very often are doing their clinical rotations in sites that are not major academic medical centers. And so they have to really go searching for a really high quality, influential letters of recommendation.
So I'm gonna draw on our residence experience again here. both international grads and osteopathic applicants both struggle with getting audition rotations or acting internships, whatever you want to call them. Sort of a two-pronged question for each of you, and that is, one, what advice do you have on finding these, and two, how to best perform when you're on them? I guess we'll start with Famika this time, but what do you think, like, for both of you? How do you how do you seek them out, and then how do you ensure that you're performing well?
Yeah, I think it's sort of a multi-pronged approach. You can talk to your classmates and use the network. I know SGU, we have a huge student population, and talking to folks who've done similar experiences, whether or not they felt that they were worthwhile. But I also, when I was in medical school, I would cold call places that I wanted to do rotations at, or contact their coordinators like, hey, I'm an IMG. I know this is not a traditional path. Is there a way for me to do an acting internship on service for a month? And ask what are the dates and what are the requirements? Is it and was it a feasible thing? I got a lot of rejections, but I also got a few, acting internships, and I got interviews as a result of those. When I got there, sitting down with either the senior or the chief resident of that service, as well as with the faculty and members, what is the expectation for me and how can I best perform? And I did my best every single day to exceed those expectations. I would check in every week with my senior resident or whoever was the resident I was working with closely, like, what can I do better? What am I doing wrong? What's working, what's not, and how can I take it to the next level? I thought that was very valuable. I don't know that that's the only way, but it was the way that I approached it, and it worked very well for me.
How about you, Krista? What do you think?
Yeah, I think I had similar advice from what Fakima was saying she received in terms of being an osteopathic applicant. I did all of my clinical rotations at a very small rural hospital, and I had zero sort of interaction with residents or, academic institutions prior to the opportunity to do sub-acting internships or sub-I's audition rotations, all of the above. And so I think part of it, one, is I think it's okay to have preferences about like where you want to be in the world, in the country, right? So, when you're trying to choose sub-internships or audition rotations, if you're trying to go somewhere for residency, I think it's, reaching out, emailing those program coordinators. What are their protocols for sub-acting internships, audition rotations? How can you make connections with those programs? I also used VSAS. I think, I think that's still a thing. And so those were how I did it. And I ultimately ended up doing 5 audition rotations. And I used that also as an opportunity, in general surgery, there's sort of a line between community programs and, 5-year programs versus programs that offer research and those sort of things. And I think mixing those up is good too. But on top of the usual pathways to applying, just really emailing the program coordinators to the programs that you're interested in, similar to maybe cold calling, is definitely the way to go. In terms of what to do when you get there, I think one of the biggest things is just, making sure you can be nervous and you can be all of those things, but remembering to be like a kind human, and we're all working here today is one of the most important things, because people will often remember you for, the way you acted or the way you helped out or things like that. I think everyone gets nervous and they don't know what their expectations are. So if the residents don't take time to sort of tell you where you're supposed to be or what you're supposed to do or the expectations for you on this rotation, those are really important things for you to ask and for you to know. And then, on the next level, building relationships with the attendings that you're working with. And as the other panelists have pointed out, talking to the program director or whoever may be the contact at that program is also going to be important for building a relationship and looking for that letter of recommendation. Ultimately, I received a letter from somebody that I worked with who was well known. And while I didn't interview at that program, every other place I interviewed with commented on that letter. So that was really integral into my match experience, despite that not being a program that I was ultimately offered an interview at.
I would say one thing. Go ahead, Famika.
I will jump in on the letters. I did all of my 3rd-year rotations at a community hospital, was not very academic. You don't necessarily, I guess, in my experience, need to have, some well-known name writing your letter. But you need your letter writer to know you well and to have very positive things to say. I guess having reviewed applications this past year, I didn't take as much stock in the name of the letter writer so much as the content of the letter. If all I see is a regurgitated CV, then it's like it doesn't do as much for me in terms of, is this what I want in a program, or give me a sense of how this applicant would perform in certain settings, versus more personalized letters, even if they're not from well-known surgeons. If they know you very well and they're going to bat for you, I think that means a lot too.
I think one thing, and I know I'm moderating, so I shouldn't comment, but one piece of advice I would give everybody is the person who holds the biggest keys to the castle is actually the residency coordinator. And do not underestimate the influence of the people who you interact with who aren't program directors. They may just be the secretary or the administrative assistant, but they in many ways hold the keys to the castle. Jim, can I ask you a question? That is,
sure.
For the international folks, this doesn't apply to much of the DO folks. Where's the best place to find information? I don't need you to go into all the nitty-gritty detail, but where's the best place for people to find information on visas and H1 visas and J1 and things like that? Where's a good place to find that information?
That's a difficult question. Let me make a couple comments before I move on to your question. One is I was going to emphasize the importance of the coordinators. In fact, you may recall that there was a paper presented at the APDS either last year or the year before that took note of the fact that the coordinator's opinion as to who would be a successful resident in a program turned out to be the most important factor when this was looked at retrospectively. And because the program coordinators know a lot more about the applicant than you would think. They know how quickly you respond to questions, how communicative you are, how organized you are, and a host of things which are really important in surgical residency. And they do hold the keys to the castle in many instances. The other thing I'd say is that a good letter of recommendation in surgery doesn't necessarily have to come from somebody with a big name, because as you brought up before we started the session, PJ, it's a small fraternity. So we know each other through the American College of Surgeons, the Association of Program Directors in Surgery, and the Association for Surgical Education. And these are really closely knit relationships. And a lot of the people that apply to my program or who ultimately are interviewed in my program are people who have come to me through the relationships I have in our professional organizations. It's a small world. So they're not coming from famous surgeons, but they're coming from people I know. And that's a really important thing. And so then your question had to do with
where's a good spot to, or a location to sort of summarize the whole complex visa question, which I know is problematic for many.
Yeah, it's problematic, and New York Presbyterian would be a good example of that. Up until my most current graduating class, we didn't interview anybody who didn't already have a visa. So we would not sponsor any visas, and it wasn't my decision or our department's decision. It was an institutional, overarching institutional decision. However, the opinion was changed when we matched with a graduate of the Cornell University Medical College in Qatar, who was a Canadian citizen. And he was a great graduate. He came from a Cornell-based educational institution, and we wanted him, so we stuck our neck out sort of in order to sponsor his visa. And it turns out that it was actually not a problem. What program directors or institutions worry about is that they will employ a resident who does not have a visa, and then it won't come through in time for them to start the year, or maybe even several months into the year. But I can tell you from personal experience that it has not proved to be true. That sponsoring a visa need not be a limiting factor. I think that in looking for information about this, I hate to recommend that people go to lawyers, but there are lawyers that specialize in this, and I think they can give you some of the most meaningful information about dealing with your visa in postgraduate medical education.
So I'm gonna go to Jen here. Well, and I'd be interested also in Famika and Chris's thought, and that is, I know one of the things, given the difficulty of matching, sometimes people apply to a couple different residencies in order to be able to pivot, because it's better to have a job than not have a job. That was always contrary to what I always thought when I was in the pure allopathic world, that you just, say, I'm going to do this, and, come hell or high water, I'm going to do it. But can you talk a little bit about pivoting, or is it wise, and, applying to both preliminary and categorical spots? What are your thoughts? And then I want to know from the residents if they tried that approach, or were they just straight on categorical, come what may?
Yeah, thanks, PJ. So really 2 questions. I think first is considering, are you going to dual apply? And that used to be something that just really wasn't done. But COVID disrupted that. We're not doing in-person interviews. So it's not possible for you to be paraded around with the internal medicine department and then be seen parading around with the surgery department the next week and have them figure out that you're dual applying. So it's much harder for places to know that you have dual applied. We had a very high percentage of our students dual apply this past year, and I think that led to our very, very high match rate. It allowed our students in the more competitive fields who maybe only got a couple of interviews to interview very well because the pressure was off. They knew they would match into something, and then they ended up ultimately matching into their field of choice. This is quite different than any of the advice I'd given to all of my allopathic mentees over the years. This is something that's worked out very well in the osteopathic world. So that's your first question. Second question is thoughts on applying preliminary year or trying to match preliminary year. 1, your goal should not be to do something called SOAP into a preliminary surgery year. There will be a lot of spots open. However, those spots are not likely to go to osteopaths, and they're not likely to go to the international medical grads in general. There's often a relationship with the medical schools where they have a student who wanted to go into surgery, they didn't match, the medical school already has some spots open in the SOAP, and a lot of things happen under the table. And so those are very difficult for osteopaths and international grads to snatch up in the SOAP. If you're interested in that route, my advice would be to apply to that from the get-go, and this may be contrary to some of the other panelists. I am going to quote Dr. Jeremy Littman, who's on this call. I use his study to talk to my students about. He looked at, in 2019, about 260 people who had matched preliminary surgery and what was their outcome the following year. About 1/3 matched into a categorical surgical position. Another third matched into a categorical non-surgical position. And the final third didn't have a path forward. So if you look at all comers, about 70% did have a path forward after doing a prelim year, and a third didn't. People who had the best success had the highest USMLE scores, the highest in-service scores, they had research, and they were at a big name place and the opportunity to advance themselves. People who struggled the most from a prelim were those who were struggling with a visa status. So interested what the other panelists might have to say about that.
Krista, Famika, what did you have that? Did you have a fallback plan? And if so, what was it? Or were you just surgery or bust?
I think
So
that's
go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was very nervous. I would describe myself as somebody who has very little chill. So when I was looking and getting ready for my application, I was very nervous about not matching at all. So when I applied for categorical positions, if there was a prelim position and based on what research I could do, if it looked like those programs took care of the prelim residents, whether they matched them into their own categorical program or proudly displayed that these prelims are going on to match into other specialties for whatever reason, that made me also check the box, yes, categorical and prelim. I was nervous enough to consider a family med as a backup specialty. And when you're doing that, my advice would be make sure you have letters that are not surgeon letters. Make sure you have letters that are good letters that, and this goes to the point of doing well, not just on your preclinical years, but also during your clinical years, because even if you don't want to be a family med doctor, for example, they write wonderful letters if you do well. And so I had everything lined up in the event that I didn't match categorical, couldn't soap into a prelim spot, like Dr. Beatty said, they're harder to come by, that I would have everything ready to go and if I needed to soap into a family med spot. So I was a very nervous applicant, although I don't think anybody knew that when I was applying.
How about you, Krista?
I think this question is difficult because there's definitely like a logistical and reason-based approach as to how you should do this. And then there's the I want to be a surgeon and I don't want to be anything else approach. And so I did not, I just single applied to general surgery. And I sort of, contrary to what Jen was advising, was sort of, I was like, if I don't match, I'd rather have to try and soap and figure out a plan than have matched into something like family medicine. And I just kind of knew that about myself going into it. So I don't have much to say about that. I will say that in terms of like numbers of programs, we haven't talked about that yet, but I was always advised like from the beginning that I was going to have to apply to much more programs. I don't know what the average is these days, but I think, I ended up applying to 80 some odd programs to get the ratios I needed based on, the stats about an osteopathic applicant versus allopathic applicant.
So Jen, I'm going to go ahead, Mika, I stepped on.
Yeah, I would second Krista. As an IMG, I was advised to apply to more programs than an allopathic candidate just to get the statistically, like the same number of interviews that statistically I would need with the likelihood of matching. There is all of this data that the NRMP puts out every year, number of interviews from IMGs versus for the people who matched versus didn't match into your specific specialty. And so I was not fixated on that number, but I was very cognizant of that number.
So Jen, I'm going to draw on you again, and then I'll get to Jim, but you have a unique program, and that is open and, an envelope to open in case of emergency. Like, you show up on match or scramble day, and unfortunately you don't have a spot, and now you're about to enter the soap. Can you just describe sort of what advice or what your program is? It's anybody can do it. Just real briefly, what do you have them do?
Thanks, PJ. So this actually starts in the fall after they've figured out kind of how many interviews they're getting. And we show them whatever specialty they're applying, what they're going to need to have a 90% chance of matching in the specialty. For general surgery this past year, it was 12 interviews. So starting to recognize what your likelihood of matching is the first step. The second step is identifying who's going to be your match coach for Soap Week. Who is going to be your support system? Explain the process and have them block Match Monday and the week on their calendar so that when you are in this moment, you already have your people picked. You write this down ahead of time when you are calm and months away from the event. It's kind of like preparing for a code, right? If you've thought this through, it's going to be easier. You write down what you're going to try to soap into if that's your goal, or what you're going to try to do a research year in, or what are your goals. Maybe you're going to be applying in a new specialty, so you're going to be seeking out additional letters of recommendation ahead of time because you can't get those in a 24-hour turnaround. You may be amending your personal statement. You're going to want to have all this done, pre-written and planned. So in the event that it is Monday morning of match week and you get bad news, you've already got a plan, you've already got people ready to go, and you can hit the ground running because you're on the clock with time.
Jim, can I ask you just a totally different question, but it's come up in the chat a few times. What, as a program director, given your background, what are your thoughts on letters of recommendation from non-surgeons? So say you get a really good letter, pediatrics, family medicine, OB. Do those carry weight with you, or what are your sort of thoughts?
Well, yeah, they sure do, PJ. I think although I emphasized in my previous comments the importance of standardized examination performance to most program directors, we're really shifting away from that with the shift of USMLE 1 to pass-fail. It has become a significant trend in residency program interviewing to do blind interviews. And we do that. I don't actually know, and none of my faculty know what people's scores are when we are interviewing them. And I traditionally have looked at it as a way of determining fit, whether or not I think our program would be a good fit for the applicant and whether or not the applicant thinks our program would be a good fit for them. And that's what I really see the importance of the interview as. And when we do the interview now based on more holistic principles, all of this information is appealing to me. I love hearing about people's community service activities. I love hearing about the different languages that they speak. I love letters from family medicine and from psychiatry and other places because they all paint a very interesting, detailed picture of the applicant, which is very important to me.
So Krista, we're starting to get to the top of the hour. What would you have done differently, if anything?
I think hindsight's 2020. So when I decided that I wanted to do general surgery, and I sort of hinted at this earlier, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but by the time I had made my rank list and had been on my sub-Is and had done my community rural general surgery rotations, I grew up in a small town in Colorado, and I was like, I want to be a community rural general surgeon. And then I matched with the University of Nebraska, and here I am in all these academic stuff. And, years down the line, I decided I wanted to do pediatric surgery, which ultimately is very, academic and research heavy. And had I not been where I'm at, that may have been difficult for me to transition into. So the biggest thing I would say is, keep an open mind and take the opportunities as they come your way. And, when you're looking to match somewhere, make sure that you sort of cast a wide net, because you never know what you're going to be interested in the future. And then I also would say, just stay true to yourself, be yourself. It's okay to acknowledge the things that are important to you and prioritize them that way. And I think in terms of finding a residency, the best thing for you is going to be somewhere where you're going to be happy and you're going to fit. And so, staying true to those things is going to help you find that match. And
How about you, Famika? What would you do differently?
I think when I was applying, I applied very broadly. I wasn't entirely sure where I wanted to end up. I'm originally from California, but I had spent, about a decade of my adult life on the East Coast. I had a big community of friends and family over there, but I applied broadly. How I ended up in Nebraska is still a mystery to my family. But, as I was going through the interview process and meeting folks from different programs, I realized, what would best serve me, because at that time I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do, was to either look at what we call hybrid programs, or more academic programs that would give me that opportunity if I wanted to apply for fellowship or pursue something more academic, or have those opportunities available and that exposure. But I also looked a lot at programs that didn't have a ton of fellows in the department, because I didn't want to compete for those educational opportunities inside and outside of the OR. I feel very blessed to be at Creighton because we don't have many fellows that we interact with. And when we do interact with a few fellows here, their whole goal is, can I walk a junior resident through a procedure and bail them out when they accidentally bag a critical structure, right? They're doing it for their training. They're not trying to just take the case and have us hold camera. And it's a little hard to suss out until you get on the interview, but I didn't focus. I initially focused very much on geography, and then I realized it was more the culture of the program that mattered more to me. And it's hard now in the era of Zoom to get a feel for that, but ask around, ask your faculty, because they know people. And like Dr. Schnartz is saying, it's a very small community.
Jim, we'll pick on you, my friend. What are your top two pieces of advice for your international students as they're applying?
I think my top piece of advice has to do with what I was talking about when I talked about doing fourth year electives, which is to find yourself in a position where you can demonstrate how good you are and also engender support from those with whom you're working in order to carry yourself forward. And the second piece of advice I would have is to maximize your whole picture, your whole personality and who you are over and above being a medical student, because I think that's really important. I think one of my most successful residents of all time did not have very good USMLE scores back when we knew exactly what they were. And I got a handwritten note from her saying, there's a lot more to me than my USMLE scores. And I'd appreciate some additional, and I would value additional consideration. And so, yeah, she won herself an interview with that and ended up being one of the most successful residents of all time in our program. And so just sticking up for yourself and your whole self is an important thing to me.
So same question to you, Jen. What are your two best pieces of advice for the osteopaths?
Best pieces of advice. I wish I didn't have to say this, but doing as well as you can on your USMLE Step 2 is just going to open a lot of doors for you. That's going to get somebody to take a look at your application. Then the next best piece of advice is surround yourself with good people who can be good mentors. Going to things like this, joining the American College of Surgeons Medical Student Committee, put a plug in for the national meeting coming up in October. Go to that. Surrounding yourself with good people and using good information. There is so much poor information out there, and you all want to believe the one-off stories of the person who was able to get in despite their USMLE failure and their DUI arrest. Those are one-offs, and that's not good. Those are not good stories for you to follow. Try to be as evidence-based as possible and really think through what you're doing. When you are applying for residency, you are telling a story. When you applied for medical school, you were sort of shooting darts at a dartboard and you were just trying to check all these random boxes. But as a resident, you're really trying to tell this entire story about yourself and your application. And good luck to
everybody. Speaking of stories, Famika and Krista, what did you put in your personal statements?
So I didn't mention this earlier, but research is always the first question I get. And I had almost zero research experience going into residency. It was very difficult in the environment that I was. And I mean, not for lack of trying, but instead I was in the global medicine track in my school and I did over 6 outreach opportunities. So I wrote my personal statement about my time doing that and how that was a passionate part of my career and how I sort of found myself, with the lesson that everything is figure outable. So that's what I wrote about.
Love it.
How about you, Famika?
So I did 4 years of clinical research between undergraduate and medical school. And so, that was a big part of my life. And I leaned into that because, that's where I had my first interest in colorectal surgery, and then subsequently on different rotations. And then now in residency, it's really solidified that this is the way. Dr. Beatty's biased, but I talked a lot about my research and the fact that I continued doing research even after I'd left that institution. I continued doing research out of personal interest to answer questions that I'd had that came up during my studies. Not all of my research was surgical based. I do have publications about autism and the genomics and genetics of autism, which I'm not a geneticist. I'm not a pediatrician, but I had questions that had come up in a course and I found a research opportunity for that. And I really leaned in, got a publication out of it, got a podium presentation out of it. And so that was something that I also wrote about, that research for me is not just a means to an end, but really a way to satisfy my intellectual curiosity.
Yeah, I think that intellectual curiosity is the main point of research at the medical student level. I will tell you, my bias on personal statements is the ones I can't stand are, I didn't know what I was going to do, and then the trauma pager went off, and I ran to the trauma bay, and I saw someone save someone's life, and I was changed forever. And I always I'm a trauma surgeon. That's almost never been my experience. So I like to hear a little bit something more in that one page. Jen or Jim, in our very last minute or so here, any closing words of wisdom or encouragement?
Wisdom. I think you just made a very wise statement, and in fact, there's a question that came up in the chat that you addressed ahead of time, which is, how long should a personal statement be? And you know what? We're surgeons. It can't be longer than a page.
Again, it has been a pleasure hosting all of you, and I wish you all the very, very best of luck in your future endeavors. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.